Hi, welcome to Neuroverse,
a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on spatial cognition. Spatial cognition is a very broad topic with several circuits and components that fit in to then arise what we are calling spatial cognition. And it's involved in several other cognitive functions as well, such as memory and navigation, etc.
Which is something we also explored on a previous episode on the hippocampus, where we talked about how important our perception of space is for our perception of everything and our memory, because in order to sort of place ourselves in our experiences, we need to have that sense of space. And also for navigation, which is an essential part of everyday life, we need to have a sense of spatial cognition.
Yeah, and so we basically question whether it's possible to decouple spatial cognition or the medial entorhinal cortex from any other experience that we have, especially related to memory.
Yeah.
As I've mentioned, there are several different circuits that you can study related to spatial cognition. In my master's, I mainly looked at the lateral entorhinal cortex, basolateral amygdala, and medial entorhinal cortex. So those are the brain areas I'm going to focus most on. Whereas Clara also looked at the dentate gyrus, so I'm sure she'll say a lot about that as well.
Yeah, and just for some background, the entorhinal cortex is the brain area that is most associated with spatial cognition, and it's located sort of in a mouse. It sits kind of at the bottom of the brain at the back, and then in a human it sits kind of on the edge of the hippocampus, and it provides the major source of inputs to the hippocampus. So for my master's, I focus on the circuit between the entorhinal cortex and the first subregion of the hippocampus, the dentate gyrus. Yeah. Also, something that I find unique about the spatial cognition field in neuroscience is I find it kind of requires a different way of thinking to a lot of the rest of neuroscience. So in order to understand how we perceive space, we need to also understand how space works. So I think if you are going to go and understand spatial cognition as a function, you need to know what in the brain works to accomplish specific percepts of space. So I think in order to do that, you need to be able to take yourself out of neuroscience and out of just the brain and, into the world and into space. And this is why I think it's such a complex field, because you actually need to have that physics understanding of how space works. Like, why do we feel space in 3 dimensions and the effect of gravity? And all of these actually contribute to then how we perceive space. And it's very complicated in that there's almost like a parallel of these physical mechanisms that happen in the world that are represented in the brain. So it's like a representation of physical mechanisms in the world. And so I think it's unique compared to other aspects of neuroscience where it's like memory, for example, we have a first person experience with that. So that's all we're basing off the function off of. It's not like memory is something that occurs because of how gravity works. You know?
Yeah, that's really cool. I really like the way you put it. It kind of reminded me of a sentence you said also during the hippocampus episode, where you said it would be cool to understand the biology or the sense of perception through the laws of physics or through our understanding of physics.
No, I said that it would be interesting to understand the physical mechanisms of space through how we perceive it.
Nice. So the opposite of what I said.
Yeah. I don't know how you'd go about doing that, but it's an interesting line of thought, I think.
I guess it's also the problem with subjectivity, because all of the studies we conduct are through our own perception of the world and through our own biology and how we perceive, for example, certain wavelengths and the nanometers.
Definitely. But like in terms of evolution, the functions of our brains were made so that we can navigate best in this world. So we need to like really think about how the functions we require in the world are related to the mechanisms that occur in our brain.
That's so interesting. The evolution of spatial cognition would be an interesting separate topic to do.
Definitely, yeah.
So get a bit more stuck into the definitions of spatial cognition and what all of these different brain areas are involved in. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the circuitry that I think is quite relevant for spatial cognition. So the formation of episodic memories with contextual information that enables navigation depend on the medial entorhinal cortex and its inputs from the lateral entorhinal cortex, or the MEC and the LEC. The MEC contains several specialized cells, such as stellate, pyramidal, and interneuron cells. And stellate cells specifically are associated also with being grid cells. And grid cells have a firing field that forms a triangular grid. And this is thought to represent the spatial environment an animal or a person is in.
Yeah, so in general in the brain, a lot of cells have specific firing activity that corresponds to features in the world. So grid cells is a really good example of this, and they're really interesting. They fire at multiple points in space. And as you mentioned, this creates a triangular pattern. So for example, if you're in a room and one of your grid cells is firing in the spot that you're standing, and then you walk 2 meters, it will fire again, and then you walk another 2 meters, it will fire again. And if you plot out within this one square-shaped room where a single cell fires, then it will be at these regular intervals. And overall, multiple grid cells together create this map of space by their collective firing patterns. So they basically together cover the whole area of space. So you might be thinking, well, what happens if you change environments, move to a new space? Well, your grid cells do something called remapping, which is that they'll then adapt to the new environment and continue to have the same regularity of their firing patterns, but they'll adapt to that new environment and change the specific locations of the firing to that environment.
Yeah, and not only related to, let's say, relating to the environment and encoding the environment that you're in, there have also been studies that show that it's involved in mapping the passing of time. So once again, that physics concept that you mentioned earlier, as well as imagined space and conceptual cognitive space.
Yes, to do with imagined space. There's a concept called the cognitive map, and it was first conceptualized by Edward Tolman back in 1948, and then published as a book, The Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map, in 1978 by John O'Keefe and Lynn Nadel. And the concept of the cognitive map is still prevalent today in spatial cognition research. And it's the idea that your brain has a map of space, even if it's not the space you're experiencing. So it can plan ahead and use that cognitive map to navigate for where you're going to head in the future. It's basically like a virtual map in your brain that helps you navigate in space and understand space.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's a good summary of the medial entorhinal cortex. And as I've mentioned, it also receives inputs from other areas of the brain. And so, for instance, the basolateral amygdala is associated with emotional processing. And there have been a lot of studies conducted relating the amygdala to the MEC, and specifically about emotional memories and fear conditioning. There was a study by Gore et al. That showed that valence emotional processing, such as the positive or negative internal state, in response to the external environment, modulates or affects memory storage and processing. And this induces a different behavioral and physiological response.
So how does this circuit between the amygdala and the entorhinal cortex link emotional state with spatial perception?
So the BLA projects to the medial entorhinal cortex, and it also synapses onto cells in the medial entorhinal cortex. What happened when they inhibited these glutamatergic projections was that animals showed an enhanced spatial memory retention, but an impaired cued response learning. And the opposite happened when this connection was stimulated. So when BLA to MEC connection was stimulated, there was a decrease in spatial memory retention and an increase in learning.
Oh, interesting. So I guess
this was by Wallstrom et al.
So I guess this suggests that your emotional perception of an experience or your emotional state helps you learn about space?
I don't know if it helps you learn about space, but it consolidates a learned behavior. So I guess that relates a little bit to what Ginger Campbell said in the episode where we hosted her, where she asked the question, well, are memories meant to be accurate, or are they meant to be for survival? And so it's interesting, this dual effect that happens when you inhibit or excite this connection. So yeah, essentially from Wallström's studies, there's a observed opposing information stream between memory and learning, and that the BLA can either enhance spatial memory cognition or enhance learning, depending on whether you inhibit or excite these pathways. So I think it's interesting, this duality and this separation of cognitive functions related to this link between the BLA and the MEC.
Yeah, definitely. Also because learning and memory are often grouped together as the same function, where learning is more short-term perhaps, and memory is sort of the long-term consequence of that learning effect.
Yeah.
But here, this circuitry proves that learning and memory might actually be opposite sides of the same coin type of concept.
Yeah, exactly. That is essentially what they propose, that it's a circuit that favors one system over another. Yeah.
So if emotions are critical to direct MEC function towards either memory or learning, then what other inputs can influence the MEC neurons, and like what other inputs can contribute to that spatial function of the MEC?
So another big input to the MEC is the lateral entorhinal cortex, so LEC, and it's responsible for the context that you're experiencing. So when you're in an environment, for the objects in the room or for the smell that you...
Like the sensory attributes of the environment?
Yes, exactly. And this is really involved in also like episodic memory formation. Again, that sense of time. If someone asks you, what did you do last Tuesday at 5 p.m.? You don't know. But if you think, okay, well, first I had breakfast, then I went to work, then I arrived home and had dinner. That was probably around 5 p.m. You'll remember that sequence of events.
Yeah. And the LEC is in charge of that. Maybe. Yeah. Yeah, I think for grid cells specifically, there's a lot of theoretical and computational and experimental work going into trying to find out what actually causes this firing activity that's so mysteriously regular, like the hexagonal firing patterns as they're described.
Yeah, very geometric.
Yes, very geometric. Yeah, so I think the two major things that influence grid cell firing is sensory inputs, mainly visual, so like what we see in the environment, and then self-motion inputs, which has to do with our proprioception, so like as we move through space, that awareness that we have that we are moving, because only by putting ourselves in the space can we know what the space is in our brains.
Yeah. There's some really cool experiments done with VR, and that they put mice in an environment.
Yeah.
And then, so like the mouse will have a specific task that it needs to navigate, let's say a maze.
Yeah.
And then they'll shift it so that the mouse feels like it teletransported into somewhere else, and see how that affects the grid firing pattern.
Yes, I think that the mouse is sort of running on this ball, and then it has a virtual reality in front of it, and it's kind of navigating through the environment, and that's the basic setup. And then you can alter it so that you can change what the mouse sees. Yeah, basically teletransport it. Or so you can also create like a mismatch between its movement and the environment. You can like slow down how fast it looks like it's moving through space while it's running really fast, and that kind of confuses it, and it no longer understands.
Also, another similar study that they did is they would put a mouse in a specific type of maze where it knew it would have to go along this corridor to get a reward. And basically there was like let's say like a mini wall separating these two rooms that had the reward. And the mouse formed a grid cell pattern of, the original room it was in, the corridor, and then the room that had the reward. And then they removed the wall in a certain set of experiments. And what basically it showed, I think, is that over time, as the mouse was used to having this navigational path it would have to go through to get the reward, instead of having a grid firing pattern of just this area where it was mainly doing its own thing, this original area of the maze, it then started having a firing pattern of the whole maze, as if there was no longer a wall dividing the areas. Because he navigated through that path so many times, it was able to input it in a way that it was the whole room. So I think it's really cool how the grid firing pattern adapts.
Yeah, so it seems like it's kind of aware that its path in the maze is not the only path in the environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another perhaps more obscure input to the MEC that I find quite interesting is the anterior cingulate cortex. So we talked a little bit about the anterior cingulate cortex in our episode on sleep and memory, because it's associated with making inferences with the information you are presented. And the anterior cingulate cortex projects to the medial entorhinal cortex. And they did studies where if they inhibited this projection, that the mice would no longer be able to infer patterns or infer the information that it would then use to understand that it was exposed to a pattern. So once again, it's interesting that the medial entorhinal cortex is involved in so many cognitive functions, not only the spatial navigation, but also, I guess, with inputting the contextual knowledge of the little bits and pieces you need in order to assimilate that into recognition of a pattern.
Right, and I think this just speaks to the fact that it's a huge integrating system in the brain.
Exactly.
Like, it's in a great physical position to receive inputs from actually all over the brain. So the sensory areas and the emotional areas and the contextual areas like the anterior cingulate cortex. Something else I find really interesting as well, though, is that despite this, studies have shown that if you, for example, record grid cell activity in the dark, or so without visual stimuli, you still have normal grid cell activity. And again, I'm focusing on grid cells because although the medial entorhinal cortex has so many cell types and so many neurons that aren't necessarily having grid firing activity, grid cells are really important for spatial navigation. And so I think it's a nice cell type to just focus on to understand how we perceive space. But the fact that grid cell activity seems to be self-sustaining in that it still occurs when you don't have the sensory inputs suggests that there may also be local processes and computations happening that contribute to the grid firing patterns. And this links back to something I mentioned really briefly in a previous episode on structure function, actually, which is that increasingly studies are suggesting that grid cells operate as ensembles and interconnected networks, and this makes it a continuous attractor network. And so in the structure function episode, I mentioned attractor networks to give an example of how structure function are related, even if it's not a physical structure. I'll expand more on this now. So an attractor network is basically a network of many neurons that fire together. If neurons fire together more, then they become more strongly connected so that activating just a subset of the network activates the whole network. And a continuous attractor network is one that has stable activity patterns that can be maintained because the neurons are conceptually arranged in a ring so that in this little circle of neurons, those that are closer to each other are the most strongly connected, and those that are furthest from each other are the least strongly connected. And then as you move through an environment, the activity travels in a circle around this ring. And so neurons are firing in different locations. And so that's why the activity is moving in the circle from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron. But ultimately, it is still a network so that it can maintain stability in the firing activity. And this is what is thought, this continuous attractor network is thought to contribute to grid cell firing. This is why it's a structure that's related to function, but it's not a physical structure. Like in the brain, the neurons aren't actually
touching
structured
each other
in a circle. Yeah, no, they're not.
It's really cool.
Yeah.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you about something that we discussed briefly once as a wild idea.
Yes, totally up for it.
So we were talking about theoretical neuroscience and computational modeling.
Mm-hmm.
And so we understand the space and environment around us in a 3D sense, as we've mentioned.
Yeah.
What would happen if we used like computational modeling to model grid cells, not only in a 3D space, but in a like 100D space?
Yes, I remember discussing this.
Yeah.
Well, I have no idea. I remember asking you this.
Well, now I'm asking it back.
If anyone has any ideas, like...
And if you want to like quickly do a little model, if you're a computer neuroscientist or a theoretical neuroscientist.
I think this would be really, really interesting to explore.
Mm.
Something else related to this that I find really interesting, which we've also discussed before, is that we're also constrained to the limits of gravity.
Yeah.
So, for example, I've once questioned if this is how the brain acts on Earth, then how do grid cells or other spatial cells act in an environment that doesn't have gravity, for example, in space? And apparently studies have been done to record grid cell activity in space and found that it's the same.
But maybe we need to see if, for example, if these mice are born in space and live their whole life in space, they might have a different grid firing pattern.
That's true. I think it's quite incredible how adaptive the brain is, though, because our sense of space is quite stable. So it can be damaged in disorders like Alzheimer's, where you have a breaking down of our perception of both space and time. So that leads to confusion and memory loss and cognitive dissonance, because you are unable to recall where something happened, what time it happened. But this doesn't mean that like you don't feel like you're in a room and you don't feel like you're on Earth, or that like the Earth is flat, or that you're in these dimensions. Like I feel like this is that's a constant fact. So I think it's quite incredible how resilient the brain is in that. And we don't have answers yet about how it actually perceives this.
Yeah.
A lot of the work is theoretical and computational.
And to finish up this episode, we would just like to thank the lab that we did our master's in the University of Edinburgh, Matt Nolan's lab.
Thank you to all the members there who supported us throughout our master's projects. And if you're interested in spatial cognition, I would go check out some of their papers, since they are carrying out amazing research on spatial cognition. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode.
If you like this episode, feel free to share it on Twitter and tag us, and support the podcast on our Ko-Fi page.
Also check out our website for resources and links to what we've covered in the episodes. Thank you.